All right. Back to teach another class. Let's let my students join. All right. Hi, folks. We'll get started once everyone gets here. I suspect for some reason that perhaps, hello, Robin. I suspect maybe, just maybe, this class might be a little smaller in terms of participants today because of the impending long weekend, which I am very much looking forward to. Ooh. Ah, yes, I was wondering, who is this? Yes. All right. Okay. Now, that's good though. It sounds like it's an important sounding group. Let's make sure everyone else can get into the waiting room. Oh, it's a magazine. Oh, that's awesome. It's good. It's great to be engaged in extracurricular sort of stuff like that. That's fantastic. We have a couple of minutes. Well, according to my computer, we have a couple of minutes. My phone says it's 7:35, but there's a couple of minutes, which means coffee, because I'm going to need it. So I will be right back, get more coffee, and then we will begin. We're going to hang out in the kitchen with your Sarah. That's where the banana bread is. Yeah. That's where the banana bread is. All right. Ugh. All right.
Is there an objective natural awesomeness to banana bread?
Well, there is when my girlfriend makes it.
That's the best.
Yeah, it's awesome. And that's why the dog is not behind me where she usually is.
Banana bread.
Smells that banana bread. It's going to be chocolate chips though, so the dog can't have any.
Oh
But
my
that's
gosh.
okay. I can. So
Better for humans. There we go.
yeah, it's for humans. Humans only. We make her dog treats though. Hi, Toots. Oh, you've changed your mind, huh? All right. Well, geez, last class before the long weekend. Oh, so I'm tired, and I imagine all of you are too. So we will get right underway and try and detangle some of the problems that we ran into last time with the subjectivist approaches, or subjectivist and dispositionalist, I should say. So I'll just share my screen so that everyone can see. Da-da-da. Ah. All right. So always a wise idea to start with a little bit of recap. So that's what we'll do. Last time, remember, this chapter is kind of all about values. We've kind of left behind this idea that emotions are representations of how values, or rather desires, fare, and begun to look at the idea that perhaps emotions are in some sense like judgments about evaluative properties. Of course, we had to talk a little bit about what values were before we did this, right? And two of the really important takeaways from last time regarding what values are that, firstly, when philosophers talk about values, they're not talking about, or rather not just talking about sort of like ineffable, airy sort of things like we do in everyday speech, right? We might value, I don't know, privacy or freedom or something like that. But philosophers can also talk about negative values as well. So we may disvalue something, or we may value something which is itself negative. Perhaps if one values money, well, that could be negative if you're like a greedy old miser, an Ebenezer Scrooge type character. And of course, values have formal objects. This is helpful for a number of reasons. Once we kind of get it into our minds that values have formal objects that help us to distinguish between different emotion types. So formal objects, the way that I like to think of formal objects is that they are pretty much what Richard Lazarus was talking about when he talked about core relational themes. So what is a core relational theme? A core relational theme specifies the relation between the organism and the environment that the emotion is actually representing. So fear was our running example last time. The core relational theme of fear is danger. And on this view, the formal object of fear would be danger as well. So you can think of formal objects as equivalent to something like a core relational theme, if you're familiar, as I am, with Lazarus's theory. And I'm surprised they actually haven't mentioned Lazarus in this chapter, or indeed in this book yet. So we'll see if we get to some of his ideas in more detail. But this is helpful. Um, uh, uh, I think that's all I want to say by way of recap about that stuff. I just want to reiterate that what the authors are trying to do in this chapter is to sort of advocate for a kind of realism about values, in the sense that what they're trying to establish is that evaluative properties are mind independent, right? And this is the whole thing about realism, and what distinguishes realism from, say, idealism or anti-realism, which is another sort of more recent position. In philosophy, realism says that whatever it is we're being realists about are mind-independent properties. We could be talking about perceptions of the external world, or specific features of those, like colors or values, right? So that's what the authors want to do. And they do this by examining some radically subjectivist positions. I say here a radical subjectivist theory of evaluative properties, which we saw had some problems, and also a dispositionalist theory, where the radical subjectivist theory says something like, these just aren't mind independent properties. Evaluative properties are not mind independent. They depend on the subject to a great extent. But we saw the problems we ran into there, right? Like, this is the whole beauty in the eye of the beholder sort of thing. How can we make sense of this? It seems like the people who take this position and then argue about what makes a particular object take on this particular evaluative property, they seem just hopelessly confused, right? The dispositionalist theory is a little bit stronger, but it's still not immune to criticism, right? And the dispositionalist theory, of course, says that we're not focused so much on this subject finding this painting admirable versus this one finding the same painting disgusting, or perhaps leaving no impression at all. The dispositionalist says that objects simply have a disposition to cause a certain emotion under certain circumstances. But that's still a little too subjective for the authors. So today we're going to move on to FA analysis, or the fitting attitudes analysis style of approaching evaluative properties. That's going to take most of our time. Then, of course, we've got to get on and talk about actual value realism, which the authors do not do a whole lot of in this chapter, and that's because that's what the rest of the book is for, of course. So if I move on to the next slide here, is there a possible problem we're facing now that we've sort of seen the problems with a subjectivist account? We don't want either radically subjective or dispositionalist account of evaluative properties. But does that mean that we can't analyze evaluative properties in terms of emotion? Well, maybe not, right? We have to look into this possibility first. So if we're not going to take a subjectivist route, can we not analyze evaluative properties in terms of emotions, right? That would, if we can't, that would mean that emotions aren't picking out evaluative properties, right? Wherever they are, whether they're in one's mind or in the world, or in some kind of weird abstract formal system of logical relations, right? Wherever these properties are, we can't analyze them in terms of emotion. Well, not necessarily. This is where the authors introduce a new idea, an idea that emotions that are relevant in our analysis of these evaluative properties, they need to be normatively qualified. So what does it mean? I'll give you the author's explanation. What does this mean? An emotion is normatively qualified if it is required or appropriate, given the circumstances in which the subject finds herself. That is, if there are good reasons to endorse it, right? And I mean, this is a philosophy class, but I know that not all of us are philosophers. So let's talk a little bit about what norms actually are, just to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page here. I want to hear from everybody else. Do you know what norms are? And well, if you do, what the heck are they?
Can I kind of guess?
If you wish, yes, go ahead.
I know what I use the terminology often, like I learned it more so from an ethical, like moral class where and we've talked about normative theories of ethics. So oftentimes this is about, what we ought to be doing.
Exactly.
But this, like I would also call it prescriptive, but it's not at the same time because there's other considerations of, what is already expected up until this point and like what has been set as precedent. I think that's also considered in normative. That's not necessarily in prescriptive.
Yeah, like the way I like to break it down outside of, like strictly ethical sort of spheres of interest is that to go back just to make sure everyone's kind of understanding what you were just saying. There is an is ought distinction in philosophy, right?
Right. Yeah.
So the is like a descriptive sort of thing, whereas the ought is normative. It deals with what you should or should not do. These are like if you think of what we got here. Yes, okay, that's perfect. What Isabella said in the chat: a set of ideals constructed by cultural or religious standards on how things ought to be done. Exactly. If you think of a norm, you're probably going to think of something like a moral rule or like a moral imperative, or even a customary imperative, like don't chew with your mouth open, right? Because it's considered rude. So these are norms. And I like to come at this from a descriptive versus prescriptive kind of way, right? If you think about it this way, and this might be a way to make sure that you're all able to assimilate this, is that if you think of the distinction between logic on the one hand and cognitive psychology on the other hand, how are these related? Well, cognitive psychology studies how people actually think, right? How do they think? How do they do this task or that task? Can we come up with an information processing model that describes it? Blah, 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 right? That is more descriptive. In flawed ways, potentially. But a science like psychology is meant to say how something is. Whereas logic is the study of proper reasoning. Logic is normative because it gives you the rules you need to follow in order to think correctly, right? And that's not to say that a psychologist might identify, cases of people not thinking correctly. They do, right? They identify cognitive biases and things like this. But strictly speaking, what a psychologist is doing is looking at how things are, whereas a logician is more concerned with how reasoning ought to proceed, right? So that's the is ought distinction. And norms are always kind of on that ought side, right? Yeah, exactly. Like contra Aristotle, we are not rational animals. This is certainly something that psychology has helped to show us. So that's the difference between a norm and like a law, like a natural law versus like a moral law, right? So that's the difference there. So when the authors say that an emotion is normatively qualified, what they're saying or an emotion is normatively qualified if it is required or appropriate, which means that for an emotion to be required or appropriate, you have good reasons to endorse the response. So Oh, I've always got a typo that I always miss in my slides. The painting doesn't have the primitive quality of being admiral. I suppose it could be a painting of an admiral, but if you think of the painting, it doesn't have a primitive quality of being admirable, is what I meant to say, nor does it have a disposition to cause admiration. So, on the radical subjectivist view, I find it subjective because there's a primitive quality in the painting that causes me to feel admiration. But that doesn't work because someone else might not feel that, right? We also wouldn't say the painting has a disposition to cause admiration. Rather, we would say that in our time and place in the universe, on this tiny little pale blue dot, there are norms, societal norms, that tell us that admiration is the appropriate response, or perhaps the required response to an admirable painting. Right? So, yeah. And this is I'm gonna go looking for an admiral painting after this class and see if it is also admirable. But further, the authors say on the dispositionalist model, remember, we're not advocating that here, but they're just kind of going back a bit, reminding us of what they said earlier. On the dispositionalist model, dispositions were introduced in order to filter out the responses relevant for the analysis of evaluative properties. This task is now delegated to a normative property of the responses themselves. So notice this interesting shift, right? We've gone from on the previous two models, the radical subjectivist and the dispositionalist, to looking at evaluative properties as being, they're important, but they're also properties of the objects, right? But now we're not interested in those properties so much as we're interested in the normative properties of our actual emotional responses, whether they actually fit with the situation, right? So they say, which they have in virtue, this task is now delegated to a normative property of the responses themselves, which they have in virtue of the existence of norms stating that they are required or appropriate or fitting in the circumstances. This is the distinctive claim of the fitting attitude analysis of value. So just got some. Yeah, they did it again, didn't they? They always, the authors, and again, I hope they never watch these, but yeah, the authors do this thing where they just go on and like that last, what should be their concluding paragraph, or at least what I would understand as the concluding paragraph, is really the intro of the next section, which always kind of like just throws me because I don't write that way, but whatever. This is a mind world direction of fit thing. Well, it's a mind behavior world direction of fit sort of thing, I suppose, right? That's how I see it. Let's tentatively stipulate that is what it is. And I say this because, in order to see if my emotional response is appropriate or required, I have to look at the normative property of my actual response, right? To see if it fits with the circumstances that I'm in. So there are justification and correctness conditions here. So yeah, it's like maybe like a mind behavior world direction of fit, because those circumstances are all out there in the world. So yes. In virtue of, yeah, this is something philosophers say a lot. This is a fancy way of saying that the responses have these normative properties because there are norms that we've come up with, and we can evaluate our responses in terms of those norms. Is it normal? Is it appropriate or not? Right? That's what that means. I don't know. I try. But yeah, because of, in virtue of, like virtue, like as in a good thing. It's a good thing about, it's a nice thing for us. You know, that's sort of what it means. Like, I was about to try and come up with some other examples, but I hope that's clear enough. Yeah, okay, good. I'm glad that's helpful. I hope everyone finds that helpful. So, so for an object on the this distinctive claim of the fitting attitudes analysis, what it means for an object to have an evaluative property is for the responses related to that object to be required or appropriate. So we're not really concerned with the evaluative properties of the objects of our responses. We're concerned with the responses themselves. And what we have to do is identify the right kind of norms, the norms that measure the appropriateness of certain emotions, right? Because it is by virtue of those norms that we can you know, even say that our responses have normative properties, i.e. that they are appropriate or not, that we ought to have this response versus that one, or that we ought not to have certain responses, right? That's the fitting attitude analysis. So let's move on to the next slide. So where do we look for these norms? What time is it? Almost 8 o'clock. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, just kind of quickly, because this is only coming up now. I couldn't really word it earlier when I was doing the readings. Is this not, and I think this might be the point they make later, is this not like it's talking about our responses, but then because it's focusing on what our responses are going to be appropriate about, it's actually focusing on the object? Have I just gravely misunderstood it?
Well, there are some worries like that further ahead.
Okay, I thought so, but yeah, okay.
Yeah. Like and okay, so here's just another thing I have to say about this book. I like it, but I want to ask you guys if this is the way you feel, because this is the way I feel. I feel that the conclusions that they eventually reach at the end of every chapter are actually very intuitive. Like, when I finally get to their point, I'm like, oh yeah, cool, makes sense. I agree with that. But the way they get there is to go through these, you know, dialectical thickets, which really exemplify approaches to the emotions that, having already read some theories of emotions, I wouldn't have even gone down that path in the first place. But because they're philosophers, they kind of have to do that, you know? They have to really start from the ground up and go through everything that's wrong before they get to what's good. But sometimes I'm reading this book and I'm just like, like, what? There's a whole chapter that's all about stuff that just, okay, so having said that, all of the 10 pages of this is all wrong. So
Yeah.
let's go to the next chapter. Like,
It feels like they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot by practicing the principle of charity, almost. Like they're trying so hard to build these arguments and do it in a way that is charitable, as I've just said,
yeah,
and then turn it on its head. But okay,
yeah.
that's cool that it does that. Okay, that what you said makes sense, and also I agree with your appraisal of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I like the book. It's just
Fantastic. Yeah.
it's just,
Very
wow,
thorough.
like it's so pedantic at some points that
Mm.
I'm
Mhm.
like, oh, oof, I'm not here for this. But anyway, we got to identify these norms. So what can we do to do that? Well, one idea would be to try and identify norms in the biological functions of the right kinds of creatures, right? And notice that this is kind of a teleological approach. Is everybody familiar with teleology? I think I spoke about this before. Teleology, this is all very Aristotelian, right? Aristotle and all that. So a telos, I'll write it in the chat. So the telos is an end. or a purpose, right? Or a goal, or anything like that, or a final cause, to use the Aristotelian vernacular, right? So when we talk about telos or a teleology, we're talking about like, what is this for, right? What is its purpose? What's it do? What's it for, right? So that's what that means. That's why this would be teleological. At least this is another one of those instances, though, where they're like, oh, this would be teleological. Several pages later, actually, no, it wouldn't, and there are problems with it. So let's not be teleological. But yeah, I'm just going to rant about. I better stop because I will not stop ranting about their approach here. But what they say here, like, what sense would these norms be teleological? Well, on page 45, they write an emotion in this sense is teleological. This norms are teleological because the emotion is appropriate if it promotes the biological fitness of its subject, or alternatively, that of the subject social group or some of his genes, right? And we can flesh this out with some examples. But before we do, I want to make sure that everybody understands what fitness is as well. We often hear of the theory of evolution, and people talk about it like survival of the fittest means the biggest and the strongest, right? Everybody's heard this before, right? Survival of the fittest. The biggest lion wins. The biggest humans, the strongest, the fastest, they are the fittest, right? Is that what that means? I'll put it to all of you. Is that what that means? Chelsea says most properly functioning. That's close. That's close. One more. Does anyone else want to guess? All right, well, I'll tell you. Fitness in the evolutionary sense means you're good at propagating your genes to future generations, and those genes confer some adaptive benefit, right? So fitness, I could measure the fitness of a creature in terms of how many copies of its gene are in the gene pool, right? So a life form that's fit has not just physical traits that are adaptive, that serve a function, which is what Chelsea is saying here in the chat, but also there's lots of copies. I'm having lots of kids, and they're having kids, and my genes are propagating through the gene pool. That's fitness. So everybody should make sure, just so you understand, that is what it means. It doesn't mean the strongest survive. It means the fittest survive. They survive because, not the individual, but their genes survive. Survival of the fittest genes. And also, I should draw your attention to something here in the quote, that there's lots of different points of view we can take when it comes to the theory of evolution. We don't have to necessarily look at it at the level of the individual, but we can also look at it in terms of the individual's group. So there's something called group fitness, or we can look at it at the level of the gene. So there's multiple sort of levels of spatial and temporal granularity we can examine this. But what are some examples of an emotion that would be appropriate if it promotes biological fitness, now that we have some understanding what fitness is in the evolutionary sense?
Would patience be I don't know, if temperance maybe?
Perhaps. How could that increase fitness?
Being agreeable, I think, at a social level.
So it might help to promote individual or group fitness, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's also, there's evidence that we've got about evolution kind of not encouraging people who were really aggressive in their group. Like that this wasn't a way to propagate your genes, if we are going to use these terms. Most often it was people who were more level-headed and able to be socially cohesive.
Yeah. So that would be a great example then. Okay. Of course, some other easy examples are the basic emotions, if there are basic emotions, right? I mean, it's very easy to see how fear is adaptive or can increase fitness, right? Because you can't propagate your genes. Well, maybe surprise too, for that matter. But fear, if you don't fear what is dangerous, you might die. And if you're dead, you can't propagate your genes. So you're not very fit if you're dead, right? Disgust. If you eat something disgusting, because you don't have a disgust response, you might get sick and die or make your group members sick. And this is, if we're talking like like the evolutionary psychology kind of scenario where we're talking about early humans, chances are you're also related to everybody in your group. It's like a big extended family. So if you get sick and make someone else sick, that's bad for individual and group fitness, right? Surprise, though, is an interesting example because surprise can orient the group to the surprising stimulus, and the surprising stimulus might be dangerous, it might be important, it might just be, we don't know what it is. We need to see what it is. And if I go like, I'm surprised, everyone else automatically will turn and look at me and then turn and look at what I'm pointing at, right? So that might increase group fitness if I'm surprised by like a lion, right? So if I go, a lion, everyone else is going to go, what, really? And we all run away or fight or something. So yeah, this is the idea. So what the hope is here is that for each type of emotion, there's a norm or perhaps a set of norms that specifies why the response is adaptive. And that tells us why or how the emotion is appropriate. So that's a sort of teleological approach. But as the authors say, and I actually like the way they put this, if the function of the heart is clear, those of the yearnings housed therein are much less so. So specifying biological functions teleologically can be problematic. Yes, yeah. I'm glad it wasn't the okay, I'll explain. Yeah. So for Chelsea and everyone else, and this is why I claim the authors kind of do that thing here where they're like, this would be teleological. Actually, no, it wouldn't. There are problems. Well, I don't even think this is teleological to begin with. It's not teleological because nothing in biology is really teleological. And why? Well, basically thanks to Darwin, right? If you go all the way back in the day to Aristotle looked at teleology in nature like this, right? He would be, I don't know, hanging out by the lagoon, gathering up frogs and storks and various creatures for examination and vivisection and everything. And he began to wonder, why are all these things here, right? Why are there frogs? Why are there storks? Why are there trees? They must have an end, a telos, a purpose. The purpose of the frogs must be to feed the storks. And the purpose of the trees is to provide shade for the storks and the frogs, right? Everything has a purpose. Nowadays, we call this the naturalistic fallacy, right? And Darwin showed when he introduced the theory of evolution that there isn't really a purpose to any of this beyond surviving and reproducing. And animals, yes, they adapt to their environment. I can say like I have thumbs for grasping and thumbs and fingers for like picking things up and holding objects. Yes, I have those. That's what they're for. What on earth? Some very strange noises going on out there. Sorry, guys, there's something happening out here. I have to close my door and I'll be right back. That's weird. Did the banana bread explode? Yeah, I know. I'm just being silly. I don't know what that was. I hope it was fireworks. You see what happened there? Surprise, confusion. Go see what it is. Adaptive response. There you go.
You good?
Yeah.
He's okay. The dog's okay.
Oh, she's fine. She's actually it's very strange. Our dog is not afraid of fireworks or thunder or anything. It's really weird.
Oh wow, super dog.
Yeah. All right. Toots. Yeah. Yeah. So what was I saying? Oh, I was saying that biological structures, behaviors, and so forth, they are for something in the sense that they have a function, not that they have some kind of Aristotelian final end, right? We can say very easily what the heart is for on a functional account, right? The heart is for pumping blood. It pumps deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and it pumps oxygenated blood to all of the organs in the body, right? So it's easy to say that's what a heart is for. It's harder to say here's what this emotion or that emotion is for, right? And that's what it means here. If the function of the heart is clear, those of the yearnings, the functions, that is, of the yearnings housed within our emotions, our passions, are less clear. That's what that means. Yeah. Oh, good. No problem. So yeah, that's what's problematic about this. And that's why, even though they say at first, oh, this is teleological, I'm like, well, no, it's not, because animals aren't there to feed other animals. That's just how all of this complicated matter has organized itself under the laws of natural selection over the past, 4 billion years or whatever, right? It's more like emergence, like complexity out of simplicity, rather than teleology. So anyway, that's my spiel about that. Now, how are we doing for time? Okay. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind, and I'll quote directly from the authors here, the aim was to account for the possible divergence of evaluative facts and responses, and we may doubt that the option under discussion can fulfill it. The fact that a response favors fitness, especially if fitness is measured at the level of the gene, is indeed quite divorced from the evaluative considerations that we think bear on the circumstances and guide the way we actually measure the appropriateness of the response. Similar to the chicken and egg thing, yeah, when it comes to evolution, like what is something for? Here's a way that so on, so as I like to, as the authors say, the way in which the yearnings housed within the heart are unclear. Remember, we're trying to say that it's this teleology that allows us to say whether something whether something is that's our norm, right? Does that map onto our evaluative norm, or the norms by which we can evaluate our actual responses? Well, fitness, a sort of functional fitness approach, like I was talking about, is divorced from evaluative considerations quite often, especially if we're looking at like the level of the gene, right? So what are some examples? I'll start with one from the book that I think clarifies it pretty well. It's probably back in the day, back in our evolutionary past, it was probably adaptive to be hostile to foreigners, right? Because we lived in groups, mostly extended family types of groups, perhaps 50 to 150 individuals. And if you ran into somebody from a different family group, from outside your in-group, you probably would want to be hostile, because you've got to look out for your genes, right? And you don't know what this person wants. Do they want to come and meet you and be part of your family, or do they want to kill you and take all your stuff? You don't know. So it's better to be safe than sorry. So you sort of have an aversion to this foreign person. Okay, that could be seen as adaptive, but that shouldn't have any bearing on the way we evaluate, people who say, oh, the foreigners are coming and taking our jobs. Like, we want to say that response is inappropriate, right? Like we do not value things like racism and xenophobia, implicit bias, explicit bias, jingoism. These arguably all have an adaptive basis, but we don't on that token say, oh, it's okay to be a racist and to be mean to immigrants, right? So that's a problem with this approach. It looks like basically what they're saying, it looks like these teleological norms, if they are teleological, I don't think they are, but whatever kinds of norms they are different from the kinds of norms that we need to invoke to actually measure the appropriateness of our responses. So that is the problem with this approach. Yes, exactly. As Chelsea guessed, the next page will tell us everything is still wrong, but don't worry about it, because at the end of the chapter, we'll get a snippet of something right that will come later in the book. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, this book is making me so cynical. So anyway, what's our second option? Well, perhaps we can elucidate on the appropriateness of this emotion or that emotion by appealing to a different kind of norm, not a sort of teleological functional norm, but a rational norm, right? A norm that we can invoke in the favor of the response we're having, reasons we could give why our emotion is appropriate or not. Could we think of some examples here? Reasons could be intuitions. They don't have to be, though. They can be, I would say, an intuitive reason is readily available in the sense that the authors mention here on my third point on this slide. But they can also be more complicated. You might have to think about it for a little bit. And so you deliberate to come up with a reason. Or you might have to consult an expert, right, to get a reason why you should or shouldn't feel this way. If you're in a therapeutic setting, for example, perhaps because you have anxiety, the therapist, being an expert, might try to give you a rational norm for not endorsing that emotion by, as part of some kind of cognitive behavioral therapy sort of situation, right? So they can be simple, they can be quite complex. But what are some examples beyond that one? There is a really, now that I've hated on the book for a few minutes, there is actually a really funny example right here at this stage of the discussion in the book. Does anybody know what it is? Which example I'm thinking of? It's quite devilish. If I want to give, I'll give you a hint. It's quite a devilish example.
There's one where they talk about, sorry, I'm trying to find it in my reading here. They talk about something being, oh my goodness, I can't find it, but there's something about like if this big monster thing is going to do something, then you need to like appreciate it because in virtue of
yes,
something worse being like happening.
Yeah, imagine some kind of demon overlord
Right.
has taken over the planet and requires us all to pay him admiration and respect. Well, that's a reason. That's a reason. Is it a good one? I don't know. Probably not, as the authors will say later. But I thought, oh, that's funny. Yeah, that is a reason. But as we'll see later, it's a problem, because obviously, you've got a reason to show admiration for this demon, because he'll I don't know, cast you into a pit of sulfur or something if you don't. But you can see where the authors are going to go with this, why this is maybe a problem for this account, right? But they're looking for reasons, rational norms or reasons, which would have the normative force that they need to have in order to tell us when emotions are appropriate or required of us and when they are not. And these explanations would take explanatory priority over evaluative properties, just like the previous approach, just like the first option. Just to clarify what the authors say on 46. The object has the relevant evaluative property, again, in virtue of the existence of reasons that make the emotion appropriate. So it's not like the evaluative property, remember, because this is not realism. We haven't got to the realism yet. The object does not have a mind-independent evaluative property here. It has this evaluative property by virtue of the existence of these rational norms that make the emotion appropriate or inappropriate. And these norms all still kind of begin in the head or in one's head. So this is not, this is not realist yet, but we're getting there, I hope. So what are some problems? Oh, Isabella's come up with a really good example. Yeah, so the demon example is fun from the book. But yeah, working 40 hours a week, 9 to 5 for the rest of your life, even though we don't want to. But our reason to work is to have a house, food. Yeah. People at the bottom are working and benefit the top. Yeah, I mean, but we'd have to couch this in terms of not just moral norms or not just rational norms. You have a rational norm that you ought to go to work, right? Because you need to survive. But we need to couch this in terms of emotions. So, I mean, perhaps somebody who says, you should be grateful that you have that job, right? So your job sucks. You got to get up early and work 9 to 5, 40 hours a week. You got to do that, and that sucks. But you should be happy about it because maybe the next person doesn't have a job, right? That would be a way in which we could apply. Say take that. Oh, here's a reason why you should feel that way. So, okay, excellent. Glad that helps. Okay, so problems with this approach. Well, so far, our discussion seems to entail that the relevant reasons or the relevant norms need to be specified in isolation from the evaluative properties that we're interested. Otherwise, our project's going to get a little bit circular. But is it even possible to specify the norms we're interested in without reference to evaluative properties in the first place? Right? This is not an easily avoided problem, as the authors say. Yeah, I admit this was not. This part can be a little bit opaque, but we'll walk through it slowly and see if we can sort it out. So what we want to do is identify some kind of norms or some kind of reasons that will allow us to evaluate the appropriateness of our emotions without referencing evaluative properties, because otherwise we get into a bit of circular reasoning, right? What are the evaluative properties? Well, they must be properties that allow us to evaluate the appropriateness of our emotions. Well, how do we do that? Well, we need norms and reasons that tell us how to tell how our emotions are appropriate, i.e. whether the emotions, what are the evaluative properties of our emotions and their objects, right? It could get very circular. So, and again, maybe the easiest way to make these problems clear is to try and come up with more examples of situations where maybe the emotion is appropriate, but there are other reasons why it might not be appropriate. So, and here's where they get back to the demon example, right? You have a reason to admire the demon, if he demands admiration. If you don't admire him, he will. Yeah, this is the focus becoming the object and the attitude. Yeah, I'll come back to that point in a moment, but you have a reason to pay admiration to the demon, namely that he will cast you into hell if you don't. But you have other reasons not to, and one reason seems to be that he's just not an admirable character, right? But that reference is an evaluative property, right? So this is all, yeah, this is all very confusing. Maybe instead of rational norms, we can appeal to a different kind of norm, like a moral norm or a prudential norm. One of these, or perhaps both, might sort of subserve our assessment of emotions as reasonable or unreasonable or appropriate or inappropriate. But we could just say that not all of them will play an equal role in assessing every single emotion every time. Yeah, Isabella, that's a good example that kind of parallels the demon thing, right? Like you have to do all this stuff. You have to respect the dictator, but you don't actually respect him. But you have to, or he could kill you, right? So maybe this approach is flawed. After all, as the authors say, it does not specify in which sense, a response must be reasonable or appropriate when fixing the object's evaluative property. All of the mentioned responses conform to certain rational norms, yet they do not help fix the relevant evaluative facts, right? So again, in the case of the demon or a dictator, you have some rational norms there, but they don't do anything to fix the relevant evaluative facts. You're just going through the motions to survive, right? So maybe what we have to do is look for the right kinds of reasons. And those might be the kinds of reasons that tend to immediately produce the corresponding response. And this is an idea that was developed by Derek Parfitt. He passed away a few years ago, but he was, I believe it was at Oxford. Pretty big name in philosophy, in all kinds of things, mind, ethics, pretty big name. So this idea, developed by Parfitt, is that the reasons that make anger, fear, or admiration appropriate in the sense needed by the FA analysis are those reasons which, when brought to our attention, tend to immediately produce these emotions. By contrast, the prudential or moral reasons one may have for these emotions will not do so. So I don't know. Are there problems? I mean, this seems intuitive. What's he saying there? Or what are they saying that Parfitt is saying? They're saying that what makes your emotional episode appropriate in the sense that this analysis is looking for are the very same reasons which, when brought to your attention, tend to produce those very emotions. Well, the authors think that this just sounds like dispositionalism all over again, right? What else can we do? Yeah, light bulb. Hey, good. What else can we do? Well, maybe there's another response we can offer. Whoa, excuse me. So this other response would consist in making a distinction between reasons that are related to the content of a certain attitude regarding a certain object, and reasons that are related to the attitude regarding the object itself. So what are we talking about here? Are we talking about, when we're talking about these rational norms, are we talking about norms that are related to the content of an attitude regarding an object, or reasons related to the attitude regarding the object, right? And again, this gets us back to the demon example or the dictator example, right? The reasons related to my attitude regarding the object, say the demon or the dictator, that explains my admiration of him. But when we get back to reasons related to the content of a certain attitude, well, it doesn't really seem like admiration anymore, because I'm only going through the motions so that I don't get cast into a pit of doom. So that's the problem. The suggestion is that the relevant reasons are the reasons in favor of our attitude's content, not the attitude itself, right? Now, is this compatible with fitting attitude analysis of evaluative properties? Well, what do the authors say? Yeah, more coffee. I'll just check in the chat here. Yeah, that's another, Isabella, you're right. That's another reason why this book is a little frustrating when you're sleepy, is because it's difficult to lose track of what the authors are actually arguing, and this is something for when you're writing. If you're ever writing a long paper, like if any of you go on to do like an honors thesis or a master's thesis, what you need to do is make it very clear, I argue that, they argue that, they think that, I think that. There's almost none of that in this chapter or in any of these chapters, right? And yes, that is why it seems like we're being led down the wood path, going through these dialectical thickets. So yeah, Isabella, I get your confusion. As Chelsea says here in the chat, it can be helpful to read out loud the passages, at least the passages that you find confusing, right? So a couple of tips for everybody there. So is this promising? Well, what do the authors say? They say it seems to be saying that an object is admirable if and only if it provides reasons in favor of the content of admiration, i.e., in favor of representing it as admirable. This boils down to the claim that the relevant reasons are those that make the content of admiration correct, i.e., that make it the case that the correctness conditions of this content are satisfied. Wow, what a mouthful. So what are they saying there? An object is admirable just in case that it provides reasons in favor of the content of the admiration, right? What is your state of admiration about? The object is admirable if it provides you with reasons to think, to make it the content of your state of admiration. I would too.
Can you repeat what you just said? Because I think that made it, like, it really helped to clarify it.
Right. So,
but I was processing it as you were still. Can you repeat it?
Well, this distinguishing different kinds of reasons and distinguishing, well, more importantly, distinguishing reasons related to the content of our attitude, rather than or rather than the attitude itself.
Right.
What they're saying is that this approach, what it seems to be doing, is saying that an object is admirable just in case that object provides reasons for it to be the content of your state of admiration, or as they say here, in favor of representing that object as admirable. Does the object give you reasons for representing it as such?
Okay.
As opposed to, I'm just going to admire the demon so he doesn't poke me with fire sticks or something, right?
So this is where I was talking about earlier, how it kind of becomes about the object again, and this is how we can critique it as it becoming kind of dispositionalism again.
Yeah, it kind of like
there's echoes of it.
Yeah. Like it's sneaking back in through the back door almost, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And we don't want that, because again, not that the authors tell us this throughout the chapter, but we want to be realists
Right.
about all this. These properties, whatever they are, have got to be mind independent. That's what they want, right?
Okay. Okay.
So
Yeah. That
yeah,
makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
no problem. So next slide. I hope I'm not going too fast. I'm just really looking forward to the beginning of the long weekend. And if any of you have questions, as always, my door is always open. Discord, email, reach out if you're not sure. So, so if we take this approach, we might be able to specify reasonable or appropriate responses that are relevant to fixing the object's evaluative property or properties, right? But does it really get us anywhere, right? The authors are skeptical that it does. They don't think that this approach leaves room for further specification of the correctness conditions for the subject's response, right? They write at the end of the day, or actually I wrote that, but at the end of the day, quote, contra the FA analysis, the specification of the relevant reasons does not appeal to normative properties of the response, but rather to those evaluative properties of the object that it was supposed to analyze, right? So we're back to admiration toward objects that are admirable is correct because those objects are admirable, right? Either radically subjectively, but more likely dispositionally, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And
Okay.
they continue. If so, then it is ultimately the evaluative properties of the object rather than a property of the emotional response that are appealed to in order to fix the relevant class of responses. So yeah, we're right back to where we started.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah. So to
Jeez.
continue, appropriate or reasonable emotions are evaluations that justifiably represent their objects as having the relevant evaluative properties. So yeah, that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? We've as Chelsea's been saying, we've kind of let some form of subjectivism or dispositionalism sneak back in, and we don't want that, right? So what about value realism? I've had enough of this FA analysis, the fitting attitudes analysis. It sounds like a bunch of baloney from what the authors say. So let's just talk very briefly about value realism before we start to wrap it up. Now, each of these approaches that we've looked at so far, the radical subjectivist, the dispositionalist, and the FA analysis, they suffer from these flaws that suggest that, even though there are these links between emotions and evaluative properties, whatever they are, we maybe should not try to analyze evaluative properties in terms of emotions, right?
Can I ask just to clarify?
Sure.
The way they worded it here tripped me up a little bit. We're not talking about evaluative properties. We're not talking about evaluating emotions. We're talking about just evaluating objects of emotions via emotions, and we're saying that we ought to not do that, correct?
That's how I understand it, I think. Yeah, what they're saying is that so there's emotions and there's evaluative properties. An evaluative property would be what we've been considering, like being admirable or being frightening or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
The evaluative property is what the core relational theme, it's like the formal object, right? That's the other thing. They mention formal objects and then don't talk about them anymore.
Stop talking about them. I know.
Yeah, like why would you stop?
It was fun. It was so good to bring it up, and then it's gone.
Yeah, they just don't continue, and it's like, oh yeah, that's what they're talking about. So I don't know, man, this book.
Maybe
But yeah,
okay.
yeah. So there are links between emotions and evaluative properties, but we shouldn't try to understand evaluative properties in terms of emotions. Instead, we could try approaches, finally, that treat these evaluative properties as mind independent. Because if we try to analyze evaluative properties in terms of emotions, well, then emotions are not, then evaluative properties are not mind independent, right? So let's try realism. And I like realism. Okay. Let's talk about it real quick, just to make sure that we did this last time, right? We talked about, I believe, or was that in my other class? I can't remember. Realism. What is it? I'll put this question to everybody. What is realism in philosophy? We've already kind of specified what it is, right? Realism is saying that things are mind independent. There exist things outside of the mind, right? Yeah, exactly. Robin, got it, nailed it. But there's different kinds, right? Remember before, I think I talked about how idealism and realism are often contrasted in philosophy classes, right? Realism says that, stuff independent of my mind exists, like the external world. But idealism would say that, really what exists is just all ideas, like think of Berkeley, right? Bishop Berkeley. The world is all just an idea. It's all the mind of God, right? Yeah, and then skepticism. Well, Berkeley was trying to, he was following Descartes, who was like, I'm going to doubt everything, and then I'm going to build everything up, and okay, mind and matter and substance dualism and blah, blah, blah. But then you have the mind-body problem and other problems. So Berkeley comes along and says like, it's no problem at all. It's all just the mind of God anyway, and there is no body. It's all mental. It's all ideas. No problem. Spinoza does something similar with his pantheism. Leibniz does something similar with his monads and his monadology, right? But yeah, so you have idealism, where what's really real are things that are mind dependent, right? Realism in its various forms states that things are mind independent. If I'm a realist about the external world, then what that means is I believe the world actually exists, whether I'm around to perceive it or not, right? But there's different kinds of realism too, and that's something we need to be aware of as well. Last time, I think I was a little uncharitable to the authors, and I was thinking about back in the day when I was discussing things like color realism or realism about moral properties with my colleagues. I had one colleague who was claimed to be a direct realist about color, which always struck me as a little weird. I had another colleague who was a realist about moral properties. He even used to say moral properties are natural kinds. So moral properties are mind independent. And I used to think like, what? Like, what? Yeah, what? Rightness and wrongness?
The moral properties that a rock has. What's going on?
Yeah, right? Like, okay, so if there was a universe with no minds, would right and wrong exist?
Oh man. Well, oh man.
Right?
Oh, depends. What are we defining minds as? What are
just minds, like or moral subjects, right?
I think so. I think, okay, the reason why, because like nature versus nurture, those arguments, right?
Right, okay.
Like, I feel like if a kid, let's say you guys are like, there's no established civilization, there's no like societal rules, like if you see your mom, you innately know, I feel like, not to kill her.
Right.
Like you innately have some type of moral code, like, okay, this person gave birth to me, like this is, you don't need maybe a religion or other things to tell you that, but some people would argue that those constructs told you what you should value and what you should consider a thing. But I think that there's some things that you innately know are messed up and that you shouldn't do.
Yeah.
Like killing someone.
I'm just not sure. And again, this is me speaking personally. I'm just not sure if those are morals, right? Because I'm a little bit of a bit of a skeptic.
That's what I was gonna say. That's what
right?
I was
So like what my problem with, like it's really all about natural law. Like this is a sneaky way of being a natural law person, and basically, it like well, if there were no moral agents or moral patients, would there be morality? And if you say yes, it's probably because you think, well, God says there is, right? But that's not where I'm coming from, right?
Like we wouldn't consider like a cow a moral agent, right? So even like oftentimes in the case that a cow were to do so, like if a cow's in the middle of the road, people aren't like, wow, he's an asshole.
Yeah.
Like usually it's like, well, we need to move the cow.
Yeah, exactly. He doesn't know. He doesn't
Yeah.
understand what roads are.
Yeah.
Yes, it's like that. It's like if there were no, but you can get into this about all kinds of
Yeah.
things. Like if there was a universe with nothing in it, would numbers exist? Like it's like, what? I don't know. This is metaphysics. Like metaphysics is weird.
We just read Chalmers and he's talking about everything being ones and zeros, and my brain is so sad. I don't want math to be the reason for all of it.
Oh, Chalmers. Yeah, he's an interesting character, isn't he? I believe he's a bit of a panpsychist.
I don't know what he is, but he made me sad when I read him, so I'm gonna keep reading and hope it gets better.
Well, he's got some fun stuff. Like he's the zombies guy.
Yeah. I haven't got to that yet.
And that's fun. Philosophical zombies, that's very fun. Although I don't think the thought experiment does what he thinks it does. At least not for me. I think such zombies are inconceivable. But anyway, this is all just a big roundabout way of saying that there are different forms of realism, right?
Right.
So if I'm a direct realist, for example, that means that I believe that the objects of my perception are the actual objects in the world, right? So this cup that I'm seeing is the actual cup, right? I'm seeing it, I'm seeing the actual cup. But there's a problem there, right? Like if I look on the screen, like you guys are all seeing the cup, but you can't be seeing the actual cup. It's just a representation on the screen, right? This is just, if you're looking here on the screen, you're not seeing a real cup. You're just seeing an image of a cup on a screen.
Oh my God.
And the thing is, my brain does that too, right? Like my brain, and this is something called representationalism. So the psychologists in the room will probably know about this, but I'm not in direct sensory contact with the cup. When I'm looking and I see this cup, I'm not seeing the cup. I am having a mental representation of the cup, right? It's kind of like my mind builds a simulation of reality. It's based on reality, but it is not reality itself. It's like virtual reality, right? Yeah, so easy to follow, right? And this is the way that I am comfortable of thinking of everything from colors to evaluative properties as being real. They're out there, but they're not like things we have direct contact with. There is a real world out there, but it's kind of like Kant used to say, right? Immanuel Kant. There's things as they really are, things in themselves. There's the noumena, and then there's phenomena, things as they appear to us. And they get that way because there are modes of understanding, right? And categories of perception that are in the mind which structure our perception of the world, right? So does everybody kind of see what I mean there? Just make sure I know, because that was really weird. That was really, really
That's
abstract.
so sick.
Yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot.
So well. Yeah, no, that was good.
Okay, good. So that's how I think of realism. Just saying. And I don't know any idealists, but I know maybe I know some anti-realists, but we're not going to worry about anti-realism because it's also weird. So we want to analyze these evaluative properties as mind independent. Some of these, quote, are predicated on the claim that evaluative properties are independent of emotional responses, and this suggests that the nature of these properties should rather be understood as being tied to the natural properties of the objects that exemplify them. Now, that's actually pretty straightforward. This is another way of saying, I've tried to schematize it here. It's predicated on the claim that if some object O with natural property P exemplifies evaluative property A, then another object identical to O will also exemplify A. Right? Or was that more confusing? Oh, it's good. It's good. Okay. Well, how about everybody else? Is clear? We can make it more concrete with by filling in the variables, right? So if some object O, say the death of Socrates, with natural property P, say the certain configurations of lines and colors and so forth, exemplifies evaluative property A, well, then a perfect copy will also exemplify those same evaluative properties, namely admiration, right? Like if I make a perfect copy, like if I have some kind of 3D printer that prints matter, or like a replicator from Star Trek or something, and I can say, computer, make me a copy of the death of Socrates, it would also cause admiration because it has the exact same natural properties as the original object O. And this is all just a big way of saying that evaluative properties supervene on natural properties, right? In the same way that someone mentioned last time when I was asking about realism, whether color is real, right? And somebody said, colors out there in the world, in the sense that that's where the wavelengths of light are, of visual light, with different wavelengths of the electromagnetic radiation, that's out there in the world, that's mind independent. But the qualia of color is not. But it supervenes on those natural properties, right? Such that light of a certain wavelength causes a red experience versus light of a different wavelength causing a blue experience. The redness and the blueness are in my mind, but they supervene on the natural properties, namely the wavelengths of these light waves, such that I can say color is out there in the world. It is mind independent to us in a certain important sense. So that's what they mean by value realism. And isn't this just so much more straightforward than all the stuff we've read and decided we don't agree with? I think so. Yeah, good. So just to keep in mind, there's this isn't a theory in and of itself. It's more of a blueprint. And there are different ways we can split it. We can kind of like break it down, right? It's easy to say this like this little schematic I provided here. If some object O with property P exemplifies property A, then blah blah blah. Well, it's not always straightforward, right? Because I could talk about a painting being admirable. I could talk about like my boss being admirable, or I could talk about like a beautiful animal being admirable. What do they all have in common, right? So what are the natural properties that give them the evaluative property, which is supervening on the natural properties? It could be very disjunctive, very abstract. It's not clear. The authors talk about a couple different ways you can carve this up at the end of the chapter. But, like I said, this is more of a blueprint for, going forward rather than a theory in and of itself. They're going to develop a theory that fits within this blueprint throughout the rest of the book, right? So that's it. That's value realism for today. And that is it for the lesson.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just said thank you.
Oh, no problem.
That's awesome.
Well, I was all excited about this being a shorter chapter, and these chapters are like neutron stars, right? They're very small yet very dense.
Yeah, definitely. But it's good though, because I find it rewarding that it's still interesting. Because sometimes, you get into something thinking that it's going to be really interesting, and then it's not because of all of the terminology and the jargon you have to use to discuss it. I find it to still be rewarding once we get to the point where it's like, oh, okay, this is what we are looking forward to. Just keep.
Yeah, definitely. You get a little bit of a dopamine blast when you finally get to the end of the chapter. And, as frustrated as I sometimes get with the readings, I do try to look at it like a puzzle. And then that way, when you figure it out, you get that light bulb moment and it feels good. So,
I've also looked up the authors because I like putting it in context. And there was Diana was giving like some sort of like video talk thing through the university that he works at. And it was really basically explaining kind of the overarching theory that they've got going on here. And it was like a 5-minute video kind of thing. It was very, very, very brief.
would you mind sharing that over the Discord server?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'd like to take a look, and I'm sure that everyone else would as well.
Definitely warmed me up to like, okay, there's a person behind this.
Yeah.
This is how he speaks, and this is how he's, putting this to paper. So.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That sounds very helpful.
Yeah, I'll share that for sure. I'll get the link.
Excellent. All right. Well, that is it for the lecturing. I'm not going to go over this last slide. You guys can all do that later. This is the part that just makes the light bulb go off. So thanks, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving if you're celebrating. If not, I hope you just have a happy long weekend. Get some rest, chill out, say hi to friends and family, eat some good food, and I'll see you guys next Tuesday. So take care.